Imagine being torn from your homeland as a teenager, forced to serve in the court of your enemies, yet rising to become the most powerful man in two mighty empires. This is Daniel's incredible journey, a story of unwavering faith that defied kings, survived execution, and changed the course of history. From interpreting impossible dreams to walking unharmed among hungry lions, Daniel's life reads like an epic adventure novel. But this isn't fiction. This is the true story of a prophet whose courage in the face of death would inspire millions for thousands of years. Today, we uncover the complete chronological account of the man who proved that no earthly power can silence those chosen by God. Are you ready to witness the most extraordinary life ever lived in ancient Babylon? The year was 605 BC, and Jerusalem was about to change forever. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had arrived with his mighty army, and the city that had stood for centuries was now under siege. When the dust settled, the unthinkable had happened. God's holy city had fallen. But this wasn't just about conquering land. Nebuchadnezzar had a different kind of strategy in mind. The Babylonian king looked around the defeated city and made a calculated decision. He wanted the best and brightest young people from Jerusalem's noble families. As we read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. These weren't random prisoners. They were carefully selected teenagers with royal blood running through their veins. Among these chosen captives were 4 young men whose names would echo through history: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were probably around 15 or 16 years old, torn away from everything they had ever known. Imagine being a teenager, watching your city fall, your temple destroyed, and then being marched hundreds of miles away from home. Yet there was something special about these 4 boys that even their captors could see. Daniel 1:4 tells us they were young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace. When the 4 Hebrew boys arrived in Babylon, they faced their first real test of faith. The palace officials had a plan to transform these young captives into perfect Babylonian servants. They started by changing their names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. These new names honored Babylonian gods, erasing their Hebrew identity piece by piece. But the name change was just the beginning. The king had ordered something that made Daniel's heart sink. According to Daniel 1:5, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. This sounds generous, but there was a problem. The royal food included meat that had been sacrificed to idols and prepared in ways that violated God's laws. Daniel knew he had a choice to make. He could go along with everyone else and eat the king's food, or he could stand up for what he believed, even if it meant trouble. The Bible tells us in Daniel 1:8 that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. This wasn't just about food, it was about faithfulness to God in a foreign land. Daniel approached the chief official with respect, but firm conviction. He asked for permission to eat only vegetables and drink only water. The official was worried. What if these Hebrew boys became weak and sickly? The king might blame him and have him executed. So Daniel made a proposal that would change everything. Daniel looked at the nervous official and made a deal that seemed almost too good to be true. As recorded in Daniel 1:12-13, he said, "Please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. and as you see fit, so deal with your servants." It was a simple test. 10 days of vegetables and water versus the king's rich food. The official agreed, probably thinking he would prove these stubborn Hebrew boys wrong. But something amazing happened during those 10 days. God was watching over Daniel and his friends, blessing their obedience in ways no one expected. When the test period ended, the results were shocking. Daniel 1:15 tells us, "And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies." Not only did they look healthier, but something even more remarkable was happening to their minds. The Bible explains in Daniel 1:17, "As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." While other students struggled with their lessons, Daniel and his friends excelled beyond everyone's expectations. God was preparing them for something much bigger than anyone could imagine. When their 3 years of training were complete, all the young men were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar for their final examination. The king interviewed each one personally, testing their knowledge and abilities. The results were clear, as Daniel 1:19-20 records, "Among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm." Time passed, and Daniel settled into his new life serving in the royal court. But one night, something happened that would change everything. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that shook him to his core. It wasn't just any ordinary dream. It was so vivid, so terrifying, that it woke him up in a cold sweat. But when he tried to remember what he had seen, the details slipped away like smoke. The king was troubled beyond words. As Daniel 2:1 tells us, "Now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him." He knew this dream was important, but he couldn't grasp what it meant. So he did what kings do. He called for his wise men to help him, but Nebuchadnezzar wasn't in a patient mood. He made a demand that left his advisors speechless. According to Daniel 2:5, he told them, "My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap." He wasn't just asking them to interpret a dream. He wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed in the first place. The wise men were desperate. They explained that no king in history had ever made such a request. As they said in Daniel 2:10-11, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." But Nebuchadnezzar's mind was made up. He was furious and issued a death sentence for all the wise men in Babylon. According to Daniel 2:12-13, "For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon." So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. When Daniel heard about the king's deadly decree, he didn't panic. Instead, he did something that showed the wisdom God had given him. He went straight to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, and asked what was happening. Daniel 2:15 tells us, "He answered and said to Arioch the king's captain, 'Why is the decree from the king so urgent?' Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. After learning about the impossible situation, Daniel made a bold request. He asked to see the king personally, promising he could provide what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. But Daniel knew he couldn't do this alone. He rushed home to his 3 friends and explained the desperate situation they were all facing. What happened next shows us the power of united prayer. As Daniel 2:17-18 records, then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. These 4 young men got down on their knees and cried out to God for help. They prayed through the night, asking God to reveal the mystery that had stumped all the wise men of Babylon. They knew their lives depended on God's mercy, but they also trusted that he had a plan. And God heard their prayers. Daniel 2:19 tells us the incredible result. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. When Daniel received the vision, he didn't rush off to save his own life. Instead, he stopped to worship God and praise him for his goodness. Daniel 2:20-23 records his beautiful prayer. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God, forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's request." With God's revelation fresh in his mind, Daniel went to find Arioch, who was still carrying out the king's death sentence. Daniel's words must have sounded like music to the captain's ears. As Daniel 2:24 records, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.' Arioch immediately brought Daniel before King Nebuchadnezzar. The king looked at this young Hebrew and asked the question that was burning in his heart. Daniel 2:26 tells us, "The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, 'Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?' Daniel's answer revealed his humble heart and his confidence in God. According to Daniel 2:27-28, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, 'The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days.'" Then Daniel began to describe the king's dream in perfect detail. He painted a picture that made Nebuchadnezzar's eyes grow wide with recognition. Daniel 2:31-33 records what he saw. "You, O king, were watching, and behold a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay." But the vision didn't end there. Daniel continued describing what the king had seen in his dream. According to Daniel 2:34-35, "You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Nebuchadnezzar must have been amazed. This young man had described his dream exactly as he remembered it now. But Daniel wasn't finished. He still had to explain what it all meant. Daniel looked directly at the most powerful king on earth and began to explain the meaning of the mysterious dream. His words carried the authority of heaven itself. As recorded in Daniel 2:37-38, he said, "You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand." and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. The interpretation continued as Daniel explained that the different parts of the statue represented different kingdoms that would rise and fall throughout history. The silver chest would be another kingdom, not as great as Babylon. The bronze belly would represent a third kingdom that would rule over all the earth. The iron legs would be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, but eventually divided. And the stone cut without hands, that represented God's eternal kingdom that would never be destroyed. King Nebuchadnezzar was completely overwhelmed. Here was a young Hebrew who had not only revealed his forgotten dream, but had also provided an interpretation that resonated with divine truth. The king's response was immediate and dramatic. Daniel 2:46 tells us, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him." But even more significant was what the king said next. According to Daniel 2:47, the king answered Daniel and said, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. Since you could reveal this secret, for the first time, this pagan king acknowledged the supremacy of the God of Israel." The rewards that followed were beyond anything Daniel could have imagined. Daniel 2:48 records, "Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon." In one moment, Daniel went from a potential victim of execution to the second most powerful man in the Babylonian Empire. But Daniel didn't forget his friends who had prayed with him through that crucial night. As Daniel 2:49 tells us, also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. These 4 Hebrew boys who had been torn from their homeland were now running the greatest empire on earth. Through this incredible turn of events, Daniel established something that would serve him for the rest of his long life, a reputation for wisdom and integrity that no one could question. The story of how he revealed and interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream spread throughout the entire empire. People knew that Daniel had a connection to the divine that set him apart from every other advisor in the kingdom. This wasn't just political success, it was a strategic positioning that God would use to protect his people during their long exile in Babylon. Daniel now had the king's ear and the authority to make decisions that could affect thousands of Jewish captives. His position as chief administrator over all the wise men meant that no major decision in the empire would be made without his input. The foundation was now set for everything that would follow in Daniel's remarkable life. He had proven that faithfulness to God, even in small things like dietary choices, would be rewarded with divine wisdom and favor. He had shown that prayer and dependence on God could solve problems that human wisdom couldn't touch. And he had demonstrated that God could use young people in extraordinary ways when they refused to compromise their convictions. From a teenage captive to the prime minister of Babylon, Daniel's journey had only just begun. The boy who had refused to eat the king's food was now the man the king trusted with his entire kingdom. Years had passed since Daniel interpreted the king's dream, and King Nebuchadnezzar had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But something was stirring in his heart, a dangerous mix of pride and power that would lead to one of the most dramatic tests of faith in human history. The king had an idea that would shake the very foundations of his kingdom. On the plain of Dura, outside the great city of Babylon, workers labored day and night on a project that amazed everyone who saw it. The king was building a statue unlike anything the world had ever seen. As Daniel chapter 3 verse 1 tells us, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. This golden giant stood 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, gleaming in the desert sun like a beacon visible for miles. But this wasn't just about showing off Babylon's wealth and power. Nebuchadnezzar had something much more ambitious in mind. He wanted to create a moment of unity for his diverse empire, a single act that would bind all his subjects together under his rule. The statue would become the center of the greatest worship service the ancient world had ever witnessed. The king sent out a decree that reached every corner of his vast empire. According to Daniel 3:23, and King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The scene must have been incredible. Thousands upon thousands of officials, dressed in their finest robes, standing in perfect formation before the towering golden statue. Representatives from every nation that Babylon had conquered were there, a sea of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. But the most important part of the ceremony was still to come. As the massive crowd stood in the blazing heat, a herald stepped forward with an announcement that would change everything. The king's command was simple but absolute. Daniel 3:4-6 records his words, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." The music began, a magnificent symphony of instruments that filled the air with haunting melodies. As the sound echoed across the plain, an amazing sight unfolded. Thousands upon thousands of people dropped to their knees as one, bowing down before the golden image. From a distance, it looked like a perfectly choreographed dance of submission. But if you looked carefully, you would notice something that made a few observant officials very angry. Standing tall among all the bowing figures were three men who refused to kneel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained upright, their eyes fixed not on the golden statue, but on the God of heaven who had commanded them to worship no other gods. Their defiance was like a beacon in a sea of submission, impossible to miss and impossible to ignore. The Babylonian officials who saw this act of rebellion could barely contain their excitement. Here was their chance to get rid of these Hebrew administrators who had been promoted above them. Daniel 3:8 tells us, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. These jealous men rushed to the king with their report, probably thinking this would be the end of the three Hebrews once and for all. When the news reached Nebuchadnezzar, his reaction was explosive." According to Daniel 3:13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. The same king who had promoted these men to high positions was now glaring at them with deadly anger. In his mind, their refusal to bow was not just disobedience. It was a personal insult to his authority and a challenge to his absolute power. Standing before the furious king, the three Hebrew men faced a moment that would define their legacy forever. Nebuchadnezzar's voice probably shook with rage as he spoke, but he gave them one last chance. Daniel 3:14-15 records his words. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up?" Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? That last question revealed everything about Nebuchadnezzar's mindset. Despite all he had witnessed about the power of the Hebrew God, pride had clouded his memory. He was challenging heaven itself, asking what God could possibly stand against the might of Babylon. He was about to get an answer that would shock him to his core. The three friends looked at each other, and then they looked back at the king. Their response became one of the most powerful declarations of faith ever recorded in human history. Daniel 3:16-18 preserves their exact words. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." These words contain both absolute faith and absolute surrender. They believed God could save them, but even if he chose not to, they would rather die than compromise their convictions. Their loyalty to God was not based on what he might do for them. It was based on who he was. This kind of faith was something Nebuchadnezzar had never encountered before, and it left him speechless with rage. The king's fury reached a boiling point that matched the furnace he was about to use for execution. Daniel 3:19 tells us, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, 7 times hotter than normal." This wasn't just about execution anymore. This was about making an example that would terrify anyone who might think about defying the king's commands. The king called for his strongest soldiers to carry out the sentence. These weren't ordinary guards. They were the mightiest men in his army, chosen specifically for their strength and courage. Daniel 3:20-21 describes what happened next. "And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. But something went terribly wrong with the execution. The furnace had been heated so intensely that the flames reached out like hungry fingers." Daniel 3:22 records the shocking result. "Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The very soldiers who were carrying out the king's orders were instantly killed by the heat. While the 3 Hebrews fell bound into the midst of the fire, Nebuchadnezzar must have expected to hear screaming, to smell burning flesh, to witness the horrible death he had ordered. Instead, something happened that made him jump to his feet in shock. According to Daniel 3:24-25, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?' And they answered and said to the king, 'True, O king.' 'Look,' and he answered, 'I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.' The king was witnessing a miracle that defied every law of nature. Not only were the 3 Hebrews alive and unharmed, but they were walking around freely in the fire, and they had been joined by a 4th figure whose appearance was unlike anything human. God himself had stepped into the furnace to be with his faithful servants. What Nebuchadnezzar saw in that furnace changed him completely. The king, who had just threatened to challenge any god who might try to deliver the 3 Hebrews, was now calling out to them in amazement. Daniel 3:26 tells us, "Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. When they emerged from the furnace, everyone gathered around to examine them. What they saw was impossible to explain by any natural means. Daniel 3:27 describes the incredible scene, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. They had been in the middle of a furnace heated 7 times beyond normal, yet they looked exactly the same as when they went in. Their hair wasn't even singed, their clothes weren't burned, and they didn't even smell like smoke. The only thing the fire had destroyed were the ropes that had bound them. They came out completely free. The king's response was immediate and dramatic. According to Daniel 3:28-29, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." The 3 Hebrews were promoted to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar's lesson in humility wasn't over yet. Pride crept back into his heart, and another dream came that Daniel interpreted, a warning that the king would lose his sanity and live like an animal until he acknowledged that God rules over all kingdoms. Daniel 4:33 records the fulfillment. That very hour, the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Many years passed, and the great king Nebuchadnezzar eventually died. The crown of Babylon passed through several hands before landing on the head of his grandson, Belshazzar. Unlike his grandfather, who had learned to respect the God of Israel through hard experience, Belshazzar was a different kind of ruler entirely. He was reckless, immoral, and showed no interest in the spiritual lessons that had transformed Nebuchadnezzar's life. Belshazzar ruled as regent, while his father, Nabonidus, was away on military campaigns in distant lands. This gave the young king a taste of absolute power, and he used it poorly. He threw lavish parties, lived in luxury, and seemed to care nothing for the responsibilities of leadership. Most dangerous of all, he showed complete disrespect for the God who had protected Babylon during his grandfather's reign. The contrast between grandfather and grandson couldn't have been more striking. When Nebuchadnezzar had learned to humble himself before God, Belshazzar strutted around in arrogant pride. Where the older king had come to acknowledge God's sovereignty over all kingdoms, the younger one acted as if he answered to no one. Where Nebuchadnezzar had promoted and protected God's people, Belshazzar seemed to view them with contempt. This wasn't just a family problem. It was setting the stage for the end of an empire. Belshazzar was about to learn that God's patience has limits, and that those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat its worst mistakes. The handwriting was quite literally about to appear on the wall. The night that would end the Babylonian Empire began like many others in Belshazzar's palace, with a party. But this wasn't just any celebration. Daniel 5:1 tells us, "Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. This was a massive banquet that filled the royal hall with the most important people in the kingdom. As the wine flowed and the party grew wilder, Belshazzar made a decision that crossed a line no one should ever cross." Daniel 5:2-3 records what happened. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. These weren't just valuable cups and bowls. They were sacred objects that had been consecrated for worship in God's temple. Using them for a drunken party was like spitting in the face of heaven itself. But Belshazzar wasn't finished with his act of sacrilege. Daniel 5:4 tells us what happened next. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. While drinking from God's holy vessels, they were actively worshipping false gods made of metal and wood. It was the ultimate act of defiance and disrespect. But God was watching, and his response was immediate and terrifying. Right in the middle of their blasphemous celebration, something happened that sobered everyone instantly. Daniel 5:5-6 describes the moment. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. A disembodied hand had appeared and was writing mysterious words on the palace wall in full view of everyone at the feast. The party stopped dead. The king, who had been laughing and drinking moments before, was now shaking with terror. The mysterious writing on the wall sent King Belshazzar into a panic. He immediately called for his wise men, astrologers, and fortune tellers, promising incredible rewards to anyone who could read the strange words and explain their meaning. Daniel 5:7 records his desperate offer. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." But just like in his grandfather's time, the wise men of Babylon were completely helpless. Daniel 5:8 tells us, "Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation." The writing might as well have been invisible to them. They couldn't even read the words, much less explain what they meant. As the king's panic grew worse, someone in the royal family remembered a man who had served faithfully through multiple reigns. The Queen Mother spoke up with wisdom that would save the night. According to Daniel 5:10-12, she said, "Do not let your thoughts trouble you or your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." When Daniel arrived in the banquet hall, he was now an elderly man who had served faithfully through decades of Babylonian rule. Belshazzar tried to impress him with the same offer he had made to the other wise men, but Daniel's response showed that his heart had never been corrupted by power or wealth. Daniel 5:17 records his words, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation." Before interpreting the writing, Daniel gave Belshazzar a history lesson about his grandfather's pride and humbling. Then he pointed out how the young king had failed to learn from those lessons. Finally, he read the mysterious words that had appeared on the wall. Daniel 5:25-28 tells us what they said. "And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The message was clear and final. Belshazzar's reign was over, and the Babylonian Empire was about to fall." That very night, just as Daniel had predicted, the impossible happened. Daniel 5:30-31 records the end. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The greatest empire the world had ever known had fallen in a single night, and Daniel was about to begin serving his third different kingdom, The night that Babylon fell, everything changed. When Daniel woke up the next morning, he was no longer serving a Babylonian king. He was now under Persian rule. But something amazing happened that showed how God had been preparing Daniel for this moment all along. The new king, Darius the Mede, quickly recognized that this elderly Hebrew man possessed something special that set him apart from every other official in the kingdom. Darius faced a huge challenge. He had just inherited the largest empire in the world, with different peoples, languages, and customs spread across vast territories. He needed administrators he could trust to help him manage this enormous responsibility. As Daniel chapter 6 verse 1 tells us, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom. But even more importantly, Daniel 6.2 records that over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Think about what this means. Daniel, now probably in his 80s, had just been appointed as one of the 3 most powerful men in the Persian Empire, second only to the king himself. This wasn't because of political connections or family influence. It was purely based on his reputation for wisdom, honesty, and exceptional ability. But Daniel didn't just meet expectations. He exceeded them in ways that amazed everyone around him. Daniel 6:3 explains what happened next. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole kingdom. Darius was so impressed with Daniel's performance that he was considering making him the prime minister of the entire Persian Empire. Imagine being over 80 years old and having a foreign king want to put you in charge of his entire kingdom. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was God rewarding decades of faithful service and preparing Daniel for one final test that would become the most famous story of his entire life. Daniel's success created a serious problem. The other governors and satraps who served under Darius watched this elderly Hebrew man rise above them all, and their hearts filled with jealousy and anger. How could a foreigner, a captive from a conquered nation, be considered for the highest position in their empire? They couldn't stand it, and they decided to do something about it. These weren't just casual complaints or office politics. This was a serious conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the Persian government. They knew they had to find something to use against Daniel, some scandal or corruption they could expose to bring him down. So they launched a thorough investigation into every aspect of his administration. Day after day, they dug through Daniel's records, questioned his decisions, and searched for any evidence of wrongdoing. They were looking for financial corruption, abuse of power, neglect of duties, or any mistake they could use to destroy his reputation. But as Daniel 6:4 tells us, their investigation produced shocking results. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. This was incredible. Here was a man who had served in government for over 60 years, through multiple kings and empires, yet his enemies couldn't find a single instance of corruption or misconduct. His integrity was so complete, his honesty so absolute, that even his worst enemies had to admit he was beyond reproach. But instead of giving up, Daniel's enemies became more determined. Since they couldn't attack his professional conduct, they decided to target the one thing that made Daniel different from everyone else. Daniel 6:5 records their conclusion. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." They realized that Daniel's faithfulness to God was so unwavering that they could use it as a weapon against him. The conspirators came up with a plan that was both clever and cruel. They would create a law that would force Daniel to choose between his loyalty to the king and his devotion to God. They knew Daniel well enough to predict exactly how he would respond, and they planned to use his faithfulness against him. The group of governors and satraps approached King Darius with what seemed like a wonderful idea. Daniel 6:6-7 records their proposal. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Notice how they lied right from the start. They claimed that all the governors had agreed to this proposal, but Daniel, the most important governor of all, knew nothing about it. They were deliberately deceiving the king, making it sound like this was a unanimous decision by his entire government. The idea appealed to Darius for several reasons. First, it seemed like a way to unify his diverse empire under his personal authority. Second, it flattered his ego by making him the sole object of worship for an entire month. Third, it appeared to be a reasonable temporary measure that wouldn't cause permanent harm. What the king didn't realize was that he was being manipulated by men who had already planned their next move. The conspirators pressed their advantage, urging the king to make this decree official and unchangeable. As Daniel 6:8 tells us, they said, Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. This was the key to their trap. Once Darius signed this law, even he wouldn't be able to change it. King Darius, unaware that he was walking into a carefully laid trap, agreed to their proposal. Daniel 6:9 records the moment that sealed Daniel's fate. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. The law was now in effect, and anyone who prayed to any god except the king would be thrown to the lions. When Daniel heard about the new law, he faced the most important decision of his life. He was now over 80 years old, had served faithfully through multiple kingdoms, and could have easily justified finding a way around this temporary restriction. He could have prayed silently, or traveled outside the capital, or found some other compromise that would keep him safe while technically obeying the law. But Daniel didn't even consider compromising. His relationship with God wasn't something he practiced only when it was convenient or safe. It was the foundation of his entire life. The way he responded to this crisis showed the character that had sustained him through decades of faithful service. Daniel 6:10 describes exactly what happened when Daniel learned about the deadly decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Think about the courage this took. Daniel knew that his enemies were watching, waiting for him to do exactly what he had always done. He knew that continuing his regular prayer routine would result in his death. Yet he went straight home, opened his windows wide so anyone could see, and knelt down to pray just as he had done every day for decades. 3 times that day, morning, afternoon, and evening, Daniel prayed with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He didn't hide, he didn't whisper, and he didn't change his routine in any way. His prayers included thanksgiving to God, showing that even facing death, Daniel's heart was filled with gratitude rather than fear or anger. This wasn't just about praying, this was about declaring that no earthly law could separate him from his God. Daniel was making a statement that his loyalty to heaven was greater than his fear of any human punishment, even death itself. Daniel's enemies had been watching his house like hawks, and they were thrilled when they saw exactly what they had expected. The moment Daniel knelt down for his first prayer session, they had the evidence they needed to spring their trap. They probably could barely contain their excitement as they rushed back to the palace to report his crime to the king. The conspirators didn't waste any time. Daniel 6:11-12 tells us what happened. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So they went before the king, and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. First, they reminded the king of his own law, getting him to confirm that it was real and unchangeable. Then they delivered their devastating news. According to Daniel 6:13, so they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Notice how they tried to make Daniel sound like a rebel and a foreigner, calling him one of the captives from Judah instead of using his title as governor. They wanted to make the king think Daniel was being disrespectful and ungrateful. But their plan backfired in a way they hadn't expected. The moment King Darius heard Daniel's name, his heart sank. Daniel 6:14 describes his reaction. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. The king immediately realized he had been tricked into signing a death warrant for his most trusted and valuable administrator. For the rest of that day, Darius worked desperately to find a way to save Daniel. He consulted with legal experts, searched for loopholes, and tried everything he could think of to reverse or modify the decree. But the conspirators kept reminding him that the law of the Medes and Persians could never be changed, not even by the king who had signed it. As the sun began to set, King Darius realized that all his efforts had failed. With a heavy heart, he gave the order that would haunt him through the longest night of his life. Daniel 6:16 records his words as Daniel was brought for execution. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you, even in this terrible moment. The king showed his respect for Daniel and his faith in Daniel's God. Darius had seen enough of Daniel's life to believe that the God who had sustained him through so many challenges wouldn't abandon him now. The den of lions was sealed with a large stone, and both the king and his nobles placed their official seals on it to make sure no one could tamper with it during the night. Daniel 6:17 tells us, Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. But while Daniel was locked in with hungry lions, King Darius was experiencing his own kind of torture. Daniel 6:18 describes the king's miserable night. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. The king couldn't eat, couldn't enjoy any entertainment, and couldn't sleep. He spent the entire night pacing and worrying about the man he had been forced to condemn. Meanwhile, something incredible was happening in the lion's den. While the king tossed and turned in his palace, Daniel was experiencing the most peaceful night of his life. God had sent an angel to protect his faithful servant, and the lions that should have torn Daniel apart were lying quietly around him, like gentle house cats. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, Darius couldn't wait any longer. Daniel 6:19-20 tells us, Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? The king's voice echoed into the darkness of the den, and for a moment that must have felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then from the depths of the pit came the sound that filled Darius with more joy than he had ever experienced. Daniel's voice, strong and clear and very much alive. Daniel 6:21-22 records Daniel's response. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Even after spending a night with lions, Daniel's first words were a blessing for the king who had been forced to condemn him. Daniel explained that God had sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths because of his innocence. This wasn't just about Daniel's faithfulness to God. It was also about his loyalty to the king. Daniel had never done anything wrong against Darius, and God had vindicated both his spiritual and his civic integrity. King Darius was overjoyed beyond words. Daniel 6:23 tells us, "Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den." So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. When they examined Daniel carefully, they couldn't find a single scratch, bite mark, or sign that he had been in any danger at all. But the story wasn't over yet. The same law that had condemned Daniel was about to bring justice to his accusers. The king's anger now turned toward the men who had manipulated him into nearly killing his most trusted advisor. Daniel 6:24 records what happened next. "And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children and their wives, into the den of lions. And the lions overpowered them, and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den." The contrast was shocking and immediate. The same lions that had been gentle as lambs around Daniel became fierce predators the moment his accusers were thrown in. This proved beyond any doubt that Daniel's protection had been supernatural, not natural. King Darius was so amazed by what he had witnessed that he sent a message throughout his entire empire. Daniel 6:25-27 records his decree. "Then King Darius wrote, 'To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions?'" Daniel's miraculous deliverance from the lion's den wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of the most remarkable phase of his entire life. In his final years, God gave this faithful servant a series of visions that would impact the world until the end of time. These weren't just personal encouragements for an old man, they were prophetic revelations about the future of God's people and the ultimate triumph of his kingdom. Daniel 7:1 tells us about the first of these extraordinary visions. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. In this vision, Daniel saw 4 great beasts coming up from the sea, representing the same world empires he had interpreted in Nebuchadnezzar's statue dream. But now, with much more detail about their character and destiny, the visions continued with increasing intensity and detail. Daniel received the prophecy of the 70 weeks, which provided a precise timeline for the coming of the Messiah. He saw visions of future conflicts, the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the persecution and ultimate victory of God's people. Each vision built upon the others, creating a comprehensive picture of history from Daniel's time until the end of the world. What makes these visions even more remarkable is that Daniel was receiving them while continuing to serve faithfully in his government position. Daniel 6:28 tells us, "So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." Even in his 80s and 90s, Daniel remained active in public service while also serving as God's prophet for future generations. Some of Daniel's visions were so intense that they physically affected him. Daniel 8:27 records, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. Nevertheless, I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. The weight of seeing future events, especially the sufferings that would come upon his people, took a toll on this elderly prophet. But through all the visions of conflict and struggle, Daniel also received promises of ultimate victory and restoration. God showed him that no matter how dark things might become, his people would endure and his kingdom would ultimately triumph over all earthly powers. As Daniel's life drew to a close, he received a final message that brought comfort to his heart and hope for all who would read his words. Daniel 12:13 records God's final promise to his faithful servant. But you, go your way till the end, for you shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. Daniel's earthly service was coming to an end, but his eternal reward was guaranteed. Daniel's legacy extends far beyond his own remarkable life. His story of faithfulness in exile, courage under pressure, and unwavering devotion to God has inspired countless believers through the centuries. From a teenage captive to an elderly prophet, Daniel showed that God can use anyone who remains faithful to him, regardless of their circumstances or the challenges they face. If Daniel's courage and faithfulness have inspired you today, I'd love for you to share this video with someone who needs to hear this amazing story. Hit that share button and spread the hope that comes from trusting God completely, no matter what challenges we face. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible biblical stories that will strengthen your faith and encourage your heart. Ring that notification